Again, in this segment, I'm going to list some pros and cons of economic growth. And normally, this is something I tease out of a group of people in a face to face setting. Not doing that here today. My intention is for there to be a discussion board coupled with this video where people will be listing some pros and cons of economic growth so that I have them thinking. But I have done that a number of times and developed these lists, and I've seen them, and something's been added to the list I hadn't thought of before. I have entered it in my notes, so I feel pretty safe in just doing this. I do like I do miss, by doing it this way, I miss the back and forth when somebody says, "Oh, that's not true." That's always fun for me. So if you're thinking that, we'll simultaneously be having some opportunity for that on the discussion board. So I think we can pull this off that way pretty well. Um, Let me tell you why I want to list the pros and cons of economic growth. The cons, when we get to them, you'll see that these are things for which there are advocacies that are very enthusiastic about their particular concern. And it could be that since they are a con of economic growth, we'll evaluate that statement anyway, that people feel opposed to growth because they feel strongly about this trade off of growth. I know that this can happen because there was a person, let's say a lunatic, in the 90s who was killing people over economic growth. His nickname was the Unabomber. I think Netflix has made a documentary about him in recent months. Um, I remember it from when it was happening in the news as him being opposed to economic growth, and I wanted to verify that, so I just looked it up, and that's pretty much what it was. He was opposed to economic growth, and he spoke very well, or wrote very well. He wrote a manifesto, he put it out in some newspapers, and it was kind of a national news thing because this person was hiding in the woods somewhere, but he would mail bombs to people and he killed a couple, I think. Um, a domestic terrorist. But that was his axe to grind, that economic growth was bad for society, and for some reason he thought he was doing something about it. Um, so people will go to extremes in their opposition to this. And I just think it's fun to delve into this and say, what is it that people might be seeing that's so negative, or maybe even what they're seeing that's so positive? Um, and by delving into it and having you think about it, you can sort of form your own opinions, and maybe you'll have to hear a little bit of mine. Um, but we're studying the topic of economic growth, and so if we're going to study this, let's not just uh, assume that it's wonderful without trade-offs, nor let's assume that it's terrible and it's just what you have to muddle through to get through the next test. Let's go ahead and explore it a little bit. So I'm going to start with the pros, just because that's sort of the low-lying fruit, isn't it? The pros of economic growth, it's a little bit redundant. The first and primary pro of economic growth is economic growth. Because when we measure economic growth, we're measuring the output of an economy in goods and services. And people, whether you like it or not, people like goods and services. We get utility from goods and services. That's a term we use in micro for the satisfaction that we get from stuff. We do, and we know we do, because people are willing to buy goods and services with their money that they go to work for to earn. Now, if people are willing to work for goods and services, it really has to be that people like goods and services. So the first pro is that we get more stuff. G and S for goods and services, meaning stuff. That's clearly an upside to economic growth because people do like it, even if you feel differently. I'm sorry, but you kind of have to acknowledge that most people like goods and services. It's just been that way in history, and it's that way when I look around. I think it's pretty hard to refute that people, speaking in generalizations, like goods and services, and economic growth is a measure of the goods and services produced. So we're talking about having more goods and services in an economy with economic growth. Now, what does that lead to? Well, if we have more goods and services, doesn't that also mean that we either have more or have the ability to have more of the things we call necessities, like food shelter, clean water, um, clean sanitation services. That's something that is actually relatively new in the human experience is sewage systems that work, by the way, and separate sewage from water. Um, Healthcare has come and improved with economic growth. I know there was a healthcare debate, but healthcare has improved with economic growth. Access to care, that's the issue, but it has improved. Medicine has improved. Life expectancy, to sum all those things up, has improved with economic growth. So we have the quality in life in terms of the stuff we can buy, but we have the longer life in terms of actually having measured longer lives on average. And you could argue about the quality of life near the end of life, because people now sometimes live very long with what people might say is a low quality of life. That's a little bit in the weeds and more than the scope of this, but we could investigate that. I personally kind of think overall that the quality of life is rising with economic growth. But maybe you feel differently, and you could certainly comment differently if that's how you feel. And I just would like to see some support of that, because I don't fully know, but I kind of doubt that. So we have greater life expectancy with these goods and services that we tend to enjoy. Another thing that I bet people don't think of very often is that we tend to have greater literacy rates. We can compare, usually the way to see this is in across space. So if we compare countries with high economic growth, countries with low economic growth, the literacy rates are rising in those with high economic growth, which makes sense because people are better connected with better transportation, logistics, better communication. So it gives the ability to raise literacy, and literacy, being literate, is to be more powerful, more independent, a stronger person. So it raises opportunity in that sense, and that's something that's been discussed and is in the literature as something coming along with higher economic growth. The next one I have on my list, I could imagine will cause some argument. That's fine. Reduction in poverty. Now this, of course, varies on how we define poverty, because there's relative poverty. There's always going to be a lowest 10% of income earners in any society. I just picked 10% arbitrarily. That's because if there's a range of income, there's always going to be a lowest range. So we'll always have the poverty in a relative sense. But in terms of poverty, in terms of some more static kind of sense of some minimal threshold to live, greater economic growth has led to reductions in poverty. Another thing, improved infrastructure. I mentioned that in relation to life expectancy, but there's something else I want to point out about infrastructure. Infrastructure, just so everyone's clear, this is the, hold on, let me get the word written down. I think I didn't miss any letters there. This is what ties societies together. This is roads, communication, water, things that come through pipes, electric, and by communication I mean phone, satellite, internet, stuff like that. All that is infrastructure, the things that tie us together. That's the infra part. This is close to my heart because when my wife and I were dating, we had a long distance relationship. We met years before, and then she didn't even notice me. And then we met at a friend's, mutual friend's New Year's Eve party. I was on the rebound, and she kind of duped me into taking her phone number. It's kind of a long story. I won't go there on a video. But she did, and it took me a while, but I gave her a call. But she was living up on the north side of Boston, and I was down here in Maryland, and we both had Verizon, so we had unlimited Verizon to Verizon minutes. So we started talking on the phone daily, and then we started flying the cheap airlines with AirTram and Southwest. Once a month or so, we would get together, and we did that for about a year. And And then eventually she moved to Maryland, and I proposed and all that. And the thing about that in economic growth, in my mind, is that that kind of a long distance relationship, 8 hours apart, I don't know that that was very feasible 20 or 30 years ago. It's only with economic growth through much lower priced cell phone calls and phone calls. When I was a kid, we had a thing called long distance. And long distance, I think a long distance call cost you a minimum of $1 per call, and then it went up per minute that you spoke on the phone after that. So long distance was an expensive part of your phone bill. The idea of talking every day to somebody, at least at my income level when I was in my 20s, I mean, it just wasn't there. It wasn't going to happen. And flights, when I was younger, I don't think a person in their 20s, who was a graduate student at the time, was going to be able to afford to hop on a plane roughly once a month to maintain a relationship. It just wasn't there. It's with economic growth that became possible, and that's what enabled my relationship to happen. So this, to me, is a qualitative thing on our standard of living, because it's been an impactful thing in my life, and it's come with economic growth. That's what I have here listed. Improved health I put in there. I mentioned up here with longer lives, but improved health I have in there as well. And you know what? I'm going to list that separately. You know why? Because if you look at old videos of celebrities even, and you look at people's teeth, you can see that on average we have healthier teeth than we had 40, 50, 60 years ago. Watch videos, documentaries of the Second World War, and look at people's teeth in the videos. And these are people who are affluent people in many cases. The politicians, the leaders, and so forth of whatever country you want to see in the videos. But if you look at older filmed things, you can see there's a difference in how we now appear, and we have healthier teeth, which means less pain. We have the ability with economic growth since earlier periods that you might look at in a documentary. We have the ability to cope with pains much better than we used to have with over-the-counter medication, better information of how to cope with things. We have just better access to sort of the home remedies than we had for small things I'm referring to, than we had even like 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And so I think improved health, it probably is something distinct from life expectancy to consider as a pro of economic growth. My son is concerned with his teeth coming in. He's been asking him about wisdom teeth. And I think 200 or 300 years ago, having your wisdom teeth coming in was a much different effect on a person's life than it is today, for example. So those are a few pros of this thing, economic growth. But let's go ahead and get into the cons. Are there trade-offs with economic growth? Of course there are. Society faces trade-offs. It's one of our 10 principles. The first one I list is probably on a lot of people's mind by my experience, and that's environmental pollution. I mean, if I'm going to say infrastructure is good, right? If I'm going to say infrastructure is good because I could hop on a plane, well, hopping on a plane means burning these fossil fuels. We have carbon emissions with that. And so that has a trade-off, with pollution. Okay? Now, I'm going to favor economic growth overall in my pros and cons. I'm happy to acknowledge this, but I'll also point out that with economic growth, the way we travel, citing my story here, since, let's say, the 1960s, is less polluting per mile than it was in the 1960s. And that's come with economic growth, too. We have gotten better at producing with less pollution per unit than we were 40, 50 years ago, even 30, even 20 years ago. And that's with economic growth and innovation as well. This is the eve of a presidential election. I, of course, watched the presidential debates, and it tends to be that we have a party opposed to the use of fossil fuels, in particular oil, and that was part of the last presidential debate. And the discussion was about fracking and natural gas, and these are things that are cited by the environmental advocates. Not all environmental advocates, but a lot of environmental advocates. These are cited as things that are bridges to a world without oil. But developing those bridges comes from economic growth. So while pollution might come with economic growth, our remedies to pollution also tend to come with economic growth. But still, something to consider, unquestionably something to consider. Another one, very contemporary issue, is inequality. When we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about real GDP per capita, the growth in real GDP per capita. That measure, that's just real GDP divided by the number of people. That tells us nothing about how those goods and services are distributed across a population. And so if they're being distributed in a manner that the very few are getting very much and very many are getting very little, that raises inequality, and it often leads to conflict as well, which is, of course, is not good for societies. It's not desirable. Now, again, I would just point out that even long before the Industrial Revolution, there was inequality. I would probably argue even greater inequality, at least in Western civilizations, where you had royal families and serfdom. I think there was less social mobility in the Dark Ages than there is today. So we can cite this as a con to economic growth, as in something that we certainly can work on, but I'm not too sure that I can blame the existence of inequality on economic growth. I'm not too sure that that's a very fair blame, but it's certainly worth considering and thinking about, isn't it? Let's see, what else do I have down here? Oh, this one I like. This is one, I just did my homework on the Unabomber. This is one of the things he alluded to. It's often brought up in these discussions, the breakdown of the family structure. So, breakdown of the family structure. Divorce rates have risen in the 1900s, through the 1900s, and then I think they tapered off in the 1990s, late 20th century. We used to have single breadwinners for families, and now both parents are outside the home working. Interestingly, that has raised opportunity for women, but it's also taken parents away from children to have two members of the household working to make a living. So that's sort of a double-edged sword, depending on really your values and kind of how you want to look at it. But this breakdown of the family structure is often cited, and usually that's the argument, is that both parents in a household are now working, and there's less focus on the household and on the family than there was when there was a single head of household working. But we can see, I mean, I can't even explain that or discuss that without pointing out that that's raised opportunity for women. So as a con, it tends to not be a terribly strong con, and it's also a little hard for me because of my whole infrastructure story. My family was built on economic growth. I've already explored that. So how can I say that the breakdown of the family structure, because my wife and I are both working, is a fault of economic growth? I don't know that I can. I also taught at the United States Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, and that's 7 hours away from home. And I did that for a year on a one-year contract. It was a great experience. But I was able to come home every weekend because I bought a low mileage car, a low gas mileage car, high gas mileage car, didn't burn much gas. That's what I'm trying to say. A Toyota. Okay. So I didn't burn a lot of gas. I could afford to do that. The roads now, I was on the New Jersey Parkway for most of that trip, and I tell you the average speed on the New Jersey Parkway is over 80. when I was a kid, going 80 was a pretty big deal. On these trips that I was taking back and forth to Connecticut, I was seldom as slow as 80. I was cruising, and I was going with the flow of traffic. So again, the infrastructure thing is related to this breakdown of the family structure thing, but I think that in my mind, this thing is the winner because, as a pro, because the opportunity I've had to be with my family and to enjoy the satisfaction of the work that I wanted to do and was able to do, the work that my wife has wanted to do and she's able to do, I feel outweigh the challenges to our family of both of us working. But maybe that's just me, you know? But it's something that's cited, it's something to think about. There it is. Isolation and alienation. You know, this was listed before social media. But let's put it on there and think about social media. Isolation and alienation. I think there's a new book out about the trade-offs of, I forget what it's called. I just saw it being pitched on CNBC this morning, I believe it was. A person talking about social is in the name of it. No, I'm sorry, it's not a book. It wasn't on there. It's on Netflix. It's a Netflix documentary about the breakdown of family structure or societal breakdown due to social media. That same kind of discussion used to be about being isolated and alienated because of the competitive environment with economic growth. So it's sort of like these social costs are always sought after, but what they are is kind of changing because with economic growth now, we're not isolated, we're connected, not in person. And that has very different feelings, and I'm not saying they're all positive, but they have come with economic growth. One could say we also have had greater opportunities with economic growth. For example, in the quarantine, we are able to be isolated and continue on. So I don't know that I find that a terribly strong argument, but it is an argument. Again, I'm just trying to present all sides, all points of view, whether I like them or not. And then this is a fun one to think about, and let's get it on here. Urban congestion, sitting in traffic. That's often listed as a consequence or a negative with economic growth, is just sitting in traffic because of development and industrialization. Again, with economic growth, we've also found remedies to that. It seems that we have an ability to, let me put it this way. I've heard it said that there are only two kinds of roads. Roads under construction and roads that are obsolete. I think that only is a bit strong, but a lot of roads in our area of the country and on the western shore of Maryland are very subject to congestion. And when they widen the road, the congestion gets remedied. But when the road gets widened, what happens? More development happens because the traffic's not so bad. And then the traffic gets bad again. Hence the phrase that there are two kinds of roads, those under construction and those that are obsolete. So my question is, would we have urban congestion even if we had less economic growth? I kind of suspect we would, because it seems that we have a tolerance in how we settle for some urban congestion, and when we reduce it, we celebrate the reduction in urban congestion by greater settlement. So I'm not too sure that I can blame economic growth for urban congestion, but it has gone hand in hand, so there it is. So overall, these are the biggies that I've teased out in the past. Overall, I favor economic growth. I think that's pretty clear. Maybe that's just my bias. But I'm happy to discuss it. And at least as importantly, hopefully I got you thinking about it. And then you can formulate your own opinion, and you can now dig into ways to support your own opinion and things to think about or arguments to dig into to shoot down to support that opinion. I hope it was a little fun.